Hello everyone, this is Michael with TOAMagic.com. Today we're joined by Ed and Paul, and we're going to be talking about how Gaia's Cradle is now a $1,000 Magic card, and Channel Fireball is paying $600 on near mint copies of Gaia's Cradle. So first off, what are your all thoughts on the situation?
I think it's a little bit overdue. We definitely see kind of these cycles. It's no surprise to anyone that in the past 5 months since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen nothing but Magic cards and by extension other hobbyist items go up in price as well. I think Guy's Cradle is just kind of the upper limit of what we can see in terms of cards that would reasonably get more expensive. At this point, I don't think it would be to anyone's surprise if if an Unlimited Black Lotus goes from like a $5,000 sticker price to like $8,000 sticker price. But Guy's Cradle is kind of it's towards the upper limit of what is acceptable in casual play in terms of EDH, in terms of what a casual player would be willing to spend on a card. Prior to this, like a week ago, we were looking at a price of like 350 to 400, depending on how picky you are in terms of condition, language, etc. But again, I don't think it's really a surprise. Usually, when we conjoin it with a set that opens very well, i.e., Double Masters, I think you give a lot of people an opportunity to be able to convert their big pulls. Especially if they got lucky, if someone spent $100 on a VIP pack, they opened up some pretty nice foils. They got lucky with like a foil Mana Crypt, a foil Force of Will, etc., and they sold it right away. It's very possible that they would easily be able to convert it into a Guy's Cradle. And Guy's Cradle is also the type of card that generally dwindling in supply. You don't really see a lot of them re-enter the market, as it were. When they disappear into Legacy Elves, it's a 4 of. When they go into a Green Player's Commander decks, you don't really see them re-enter the market. I think just kind of the perfect storm of these together is more or less why we have this, in theory, end result of Guy's Cradle's $1,000 now.
Just to provide some perspective, I picked up 2 Gaia's Cradles at $380 in trade on August 6th, so just over a week ago. They were about 470 to 490 TCG low at the time.
I think another big thing is that we're not seeing an influx due to the nature of the pandemic. We're just not seeing a influx of imports, quite frankly. And markets are becoming more inefficient, so that you're going to see some very significant price differences. That obviously, I mean, people at the internet, they're going to see that, Channel Fireball's paying $600, or that the lowest HP Cradle on TCG right now is like $785, which just feels terrible to actually say as a sentence. Inefficiencies in the market, as well as inability to functionally reach supply domestically, is going to cause this type of pinch.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many game stores are actively buying right now, either from a cash flow perspective or from a safety perspective. I've done 2 or 3 buys in the past month from people I knew at least a little bit, and they were all at least $1,000, but it was still a little tenuous to sit there in front of someone for an hour.
I think probably Paul highlights one of the biggest things in terms of in this industry, in terms of what we do, is how big of a role player Grand Prix were, real life events were, in terms of generating a lot of liquidity in the market. One, because it gives a lot of players who don't have access to a good local store, who only have a chance to sell their cards once or twice a year or something, whenever it comes around to their area. It gives them a chance to convert cards that they don't need into cards that they do need, and it gives some of the bigger vendors, the ones that are mainstream that you see at every event, it gives them an opportunity to buy up things that they need and just be able to turn around and put it quickly back onto the market and get it from people who don't want these items into the hands of people who do want them. And I think that's kind of a big driving force. And now when you look at how inefficient it is in order to transact cards, right? Like now we're going back to, what options do people really have? There's a lot of online buy lists available, but with how prevalent, events have been in the past, few years, right? It's very possible your average player does, 3 to 4 events a year or something once every quarter. It was much easier for them. Whereas now, a lot of people are going back to having to turn to online buy lists, especially if, like you said, stores aren't doing in-person buys or whatever.
I think there's also just some very reasonable things like, and this is sort of in the nitty gritty of the business, but man, it's August. August is like the worst month in this industry. And like trying to dump a bunch of cash on things like Gaia's Cradles for a local store in August, when you still have like Pokemon releases, Yu-Gi-Oh releases, we just had a Double Masters release. Like your opportunity cost for spending money on like high-end singles to potentially try to sell in store or online, especially given the precarious nature of purchasing said cards, gets very complicated very quickly.
I've done some general meta discussion with other retailers, and one of them had made a comment that about $50,000 of Double Masters and Double Masters VIP was offered to them at the distribution level just because another store didn't have the money to pay for it. And then I had also asked in a general sense what retailers would pay on a Black Lotus, and several of the numbers were, oh, I'm just not going to buy that at all because I don't have the $4,000 or $5,000 I want to sit on this with. So even though we do have a bunch of government loan money going to stores, I think there's still some general tightness. We are seeing a lot of stores close right now, so that should have some effect.
Which only hampers the market more, right? Because as stores close, then even if they were buying, then there's less opportunities for these cards that people are trying to get rid of to actually get out into the market in general.
Yeah, in general, if an LGS closes, most people just find a new hobby. They don't try to find a new store. It's estimated somewhere around 20% of players will actively start playing at a different store after their LGS closes.
That number sounds horrific. I didn't realize it was that low.
It's just general retail. Like if you move your retail store to the same shopping plaza but the other side, you're going to lose a big portion of customers. Overall, just customer engagement with retail stores is not as high as you would perceive to be when you're in this position of very invested. All right, so we've kind of looked at the supply side of Gaia's Cradle, looking at how this card is not really coming into the market anymore. LGS are having some overall financial trouble right now, but where's the demand side on all this? Why do we think people are buying Gaia's Cradle or buying more Gaia's Cradles than they used to?
I think there's a couple of things. I think Gaia's Cradle is particularly high utility for a card at this new price point. Because it can go in any green EDH deck, and well, green is the color. Artifact was the color of the artifact, but green drives EDH, and it's the type of card that's busted in a Squirrel deck, and it's busted in like your Risk combo deck or whatever else. Like it's so useful in everything, as well as being in Legacy Elves, which just got a hit from Jumpstart. There's a bunch of contributing factors that lead to like this card just being super useful, and if a card's super useful and there's not going to be a lot of supply in the market, and as much as some people are being dramatically hurt by the current situation, there are also, I think, Mike, you've mentioned this before, there are also definitely parts of the Magic demographic that are very capable of working remotely and, well, have all this money that they can't spend on other stuff because they can't leave their house. Sometimes you just kind of need a dopamine hit. We've seen this in other markets too, shoes, sports cards. Sometimes people are just spending money because they're bored, which, I mean, a sale's a sale, right?
Yeah, if you're well off enough to have a vacation fund that you've been regularly contributing to, you probably come to the realization, well, I can't really have that vacation this year. I'm going to cash it in and spend that money on anything else.
Right, because you want to feel feelings again.
And if you want a metric on how good elves and goblins in general are in Legacy, Plague Engineer is in 26% of decks in Legacy right now. It's the most played creature in Legacy according to @GoblinLackey1 on Twitter from a couple days ago.
That's a surprising statistic. I knew that Plague Engineer was very ubiquitous. It was very good, and it's a very good catch-all. I did not realize that it was that ubiquitous.
Yeah, the next most played creature in Legacy right now is Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, followed by Collector Oof and Delver of Secrets.
Sweet format.
Followed by Dreadhorde Arcanist. So yeah, a real sweet format here. And Klothys, God of Destiny, is number 9 at 12%.
My man.
What a world.
I think to backtrack a little bit, I think, when you had mentioned people who normally have a vacation fund that they cash in on, I think the work from home element, I think it also gives people an opportunity to kind of go digging through stuff, as it were. I definitely remember towards the beginning of all this back in March and April, I had a lot of like local friends, people from high school or whatever, who had kind of loosely kept in touch with me over the years, and they knew that I was fairly into Magic hobbyist related things, and they had reached out to me. They just said, hey, I've been home for a while, being not having a job or whatever, and I've gone through and I found old Pokemon cards, old Magic cards, old things. And I think the fact that there's so many people that have had this opportunity to do this that they otherwise may not have had before has also kind of probably drawn some interest out from people who otherwise may not have had it. Whether that be trying to get back into things, if you're at home, you haven't played Magic in a year or two, what better thing to do than bust out your Magic cards and, play with your roommate, teach your roommate to play Magic or whatever. That was more prevalent towards the beginning. It may be less so now, but I think just kind of the whole nature of the situation has kind of probably changed people's habits in ways that we haven't seen in the past when life was more normal, as it were.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, people had a lot of time on their hands, and I mean, people are smart, they're adaptive, they'll find something that brings, I guess joy is not quite the right word, but we can pretend it's joy.
In 2018, we saw Bitcoin almost hit $20,000. Do we think cryptocurrency now has any effect on this? Bitcoin's at 12,000 now, up from 9,000 about 2 months ago. It looks like, I guess, a low of 5,000 when the pandemic all started.
I think that it hasn't necessarily impacted yet, because I don't think people who are on the Bitcoin ride are necessarily trying to cash out right now. But I think that it's going to lead to reinforcement of the type of spikes that we're going to be seeing going into the fall. It's going to lead to those prices becoming solidified, because at some point people are going to have to start ducking capital gains tax like they did last time. Every old school card and power and everything in 2018 just went absolutely nuts. And so we're going to see some of these scarcity prices that are being established because of the pandemic and the breakdown of the natural supply chain becoming reestablished, because people need a place to put all this money that they're making.
Ed, do you have any Bitcoin related thoughts?
I think I think just generically, right? Like if we're going to reflect and look back at 2018, right? We can very clearly see a huge surge in Bitcoin, right? Which leads to a surge in demand for things that would be perceived as good investments that were cheap at the time, right? Like it's obvious now when we say things are good investments, right? But this will kind of transition into your next point here, right? When we're looking at other hobbies, right? We're seeing this across the board, right? Like, Paul kind of mentioned that people are just wanting to spend money on things, right? So when you have people that are going back, they're looking at hobbies that they once had, things that would have been interesting to them had they continued to stick through with it, right? So, especially people who are holding, Bitcoin or whatever, this is an opportunity for them to be buying things that they otherwise might not have bought if this pandemic didn't really give them a chance to rediscover these prior hobbies. So, in the case of Bitcoin, we're talking about things that are good investments, that are relatively cheap, right? Like a lot of these cards aren't at the same highs that they were before. I mean, if we're going to use Magic cards, right? Dual ends are just kind of the poster child for the reserve list, more or less almost the poster child for Magic in terms of kind of the pinnacle of a card that everyone knows what it is, everyone wants, everyone has use for it in some capacity, no matter if you're a competitive player, EDH player, kitchen table player, right? These are things that in 2018, they had reached sky high prices. Like we're not even seeing them today, right? A big part of it has regressed, right? But if we're seeing Bitcoin make a surge forward, right, it's not unreasonable to think that someone might look at it and say, and someone might look at a tropical island, for example, and see that this price has definitely regressed from its peak in like July 2018 of like $400 or whatever, and now it's like rapidly approaching that price again, right? Like it may not be an unreasonable time to buy now, especially if you had already made your money on Bitcoin. Even if you had bought Bitcoin 2 months ago at 9,000, right? You're looking at 25% growth on your buy-in and it's only been 3 months, right? Like you said, Bitcoin was like 9,000 not that long ago, and now it's like pushing 12. Right, and that's kind of the same logic with people who are cashing in on their cards right now. If you had made money opening a few VIP packs, right? If you had opened 2 VIP packs at $100 and you'd done well and you got like $600 out of it, right? That's 2 guys cradles. And I think it's very easy to see why these cards would kind of surge in price as a result. Bitcoin may be a factor, but I think just kind of the perfect storm of everything together is really what's pushing these things.
Right. That's sort of the difference between like trading cards and a lot of other functional commodities is that like these have utility, and utility means that there's inherent demand even if there's a price point that doesn't necessarily make sense as far as a day trader perspective, for instance. Because there's utility for these items, and only if people are going to make irrational buying decisions, but it means that there's just inherent demand just from all the other reasons that people play Magic. And that matters for shoes, it matters for Pokemon cards, Magic cards. And so commodities with utility are going to have a different type of profile in these situations than things that you can't really use but are really cool. Like if you buy a slab Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comic that, for instance, functionally does a lot of the same things as far as trying to put your money in a commodity that you think can go up when the economy bounces back somewhat. But you can't do anything with that, right? But you can shuffle a Gaia's Cradle, and that matters.
That does matter. Although graded first print Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 has been going nuts recently.
It is also worth noting that a lot of the grading companies like PSA, BGS, I'm pretty sure someone had mentioned to me that they're seeing more and more cards being graded, especially in like the past month or two, than they have in quite some time. It's such a short period. I think part of this is funneled by people seeing expensive cards go for some obscene number and then wanting to get their own copies graded themselves, which is just creating like this massive positive feedback loop.
The other thing is the unemployment bump dipped or dropped this week. So people went from potentially having enough money to cover their rent and expenses to now getting like $600 a month. And that is a situation where suddenly unloading your unlimited time twister becomes much more appealing. Gaia's Cradles, if an HP 785 on TCG, you have to make rent next month. Well, sounds like you're probably mailing in a Gaia's Cradle or trying to sell it on Facebook.
So that's one of the big things I've always talked about with cards like this. When they hit these sorts of numbers, once you can contextualize a commander deck in terms of a car payment, in terms of rent, it really puts things into perspective where these numbers are not really sustainable because these prices are out of reach for the vast majority of players. If you want to start playing Legacy and it's $4,000, well, you can kind of look at it as I own my car now, so I have the extra $200 a month that I was paying for my car payment that I can start buying cards with, and across 18 months or whatever, you can get a top tier Legacy deck, and that's still a lot of money. But if we see Underground Sea at $900, then that number becomes maybe $6,000, $7,000 for the deck, and you just push that out to, I have to work 36 months to be able to get enough cards for this Legacy deck, and that's something where people are going to reevaluate or find a new hobby.
So actually, I kind of disagree on that point. That's a point that certainly has been made before, undoubtedly. I think most people aren't looking at their Legacy deck or their Commander deck in a very rational way. I think, right? I think it's for your average person, right? It's easy for us when we look at a pile of cards and we can say like, this EDH deck is like $8,000 or whatever. That box I have over there that's not sorted, probably like $20K or whatever. I don't think most people look at their cards in that way. I think to most people, what they spend their money on in Magic is just kind of money that goes out the door, and then they kind of have the expectation that I'll get some amount of it back. But because they don't necessarily think about the money that goes out the door when they buy, they don't necessarily think about what they're getting back out of it, right? Like like in 2014, even like, when prices were trivial compared to what they were today, no one was buying into Legacy or buying into, I guess Modern was like
Modern was
the hype
the
for
mover.
Modern then.
Yeah, Modern was announced in 2014.
Yeah, no one was really thinking of it in terms of, oh, in 5 years, this is like, I'm going to buy a house with this, right? I don't think that's a very rational approach for most people. I think most people probably are more in lines of the way they would think about this is, I have X number of dollars per month that just goes towards entertainment, right? Like whether, your average person, goes out like date night plus movie, they'll drop like, $150 or whatever, right? And they do that, twice a month or whatever, depending on whatever your income is, right? To a Magic player,
$150 twice a month. Someone's child of privilege over here.
Whatever that number is, right? Like it's a lot of people would look at that as, spending. I guess that would be pretty high for a Magic player, right? Because that'd be like 4 booster boxes a month, right? Booster box a week. Most people probably don't spend a booster box a week. But regardless, right? Like most people think about we're looking at this from a very financial side of things, right? Because we have to crunch numbers because their bottom line is affected, right? But again, to most people, this is their entertainment money. This is what they have. This is what they choose to spend their money on, right? Most people who spend money on hobbies don't see any return on it at all, right? You go out and buy golf clubs, for example, right? Like, you can only play golf like, half the year or whatever, and that's assuming you play a lot of golf, and golf clubs have a terrible resale value, right? And like it's really no different for Magic. It just so happens that, the things that we enjoy, Magic, Pokemon, comics or whatever, they just happen to retain value better than most things. And I think the point I was trying to make with this was that, right, like I don't think most people look at their hobby purely from a financial perspective. It's just a nice added bonus that these cards, that these widgets, I guess, do as well as they do, compared to most traditional hobby or pastimes, I guess, wherever people choose to spend their money on.
Well, I think that just injects more consumer confidence, right? Like people who are informed in this game, so that they're trying to buy Gaia's Cradles or Underground Seas or whatever, like they know that they can get money back out of it. And I think that in particular things like EDH deck, like especially if like you've been playing with your roommate for 4 months or whatever, if you got to sell the Gaia's Cradle out of your EDH deck is worse, but it's not like the deck's taken apart. You can sell the Gaia's Cradle, cover your bills for a month or whatever, depending on your financial situation, and still functionally be able to do most of the same things that you were doing as far as like enjoyment and socializing if you're doing so or whatever. And that's sort of that actually would make the market more robust, right? Because people have more confidence purchasing into it.
I think the other framework that we can use to look at this is, so we pay all our employees starting at $15 an hour, which means that their take-home check is between $450 to $470 a week. I think once you hit that barrier, that's a pretty big spot of pushback or analysis where it's no longer I'm spending a lot of money. I'm spending several weeks' paycheck on this one thing, and people have to rationalize that a little bit harder.
Right. Yeah, that's real budgeting. That's not like I have some money, I was good this month, so I'm going to buy a thing that's 25% of my income plus, right?
I think the issue that we're having here is that you're expecting people to rationalize this. Which certainly people do, right? But is that really any worse than someone who is willing to take a pretty big hit on their cards to trade towards that, that foil that they want for their deck, right? We see this all the time, right? Like that's very much the basis of what we do, and those are some of the most profitable transactions that we have, right? Like those are far more profitable than someone just walking up to us and just handing us their credit card to pay for cards out of the case, right? Ideally we want every transaction to be people giving us the crap that they don't want and then using that bump to trade for cards that they do want, right? And I like, to me, I think that is a far more irrational thing than trying to budget, hey, here's X amount of dollars I set aside every month for this card that may take me like a month or two to buy, but at the end of it, right? Like if I spend 8 weeks, at $100 a week saving for this Gaia's Cradle I'm going to buy, in theory, I down the line, right? Like I should still be able to get, 4 to 5 weeks of my investment back, right? When I do decide to sell it.
Right, but they don't have that option right now, right? Like we just talked about how people, like Mike's done a couple trade-ins or whatever, but we don't have people don't have that option right now, which is sort of what makes this kind of interesting. This is why you are the Wrangler, Mike.
That's so much less fun. I guess in theory, that's why you have a Patreon. We didn't, right?
Yeah, Patreon's at like $1,400 now.
Dang.
Seems good.
A lot of that's retail tier, and like, me telling somebody, hey, don't get burned on buying Wood Elemental and Polar Kraken, like, saves them way more money than they're paying me.
Sure.
Or more importantly, them making sure to remind their employees not to buy goddamn Polar Kraken, because let's be real.
I mean, Polar Kraken actually does sell because Aohito owns several thousand.
I think the worst I ever had was we had a front person pay like $145 for like 3 Burnham gins. This was in like 2015. They had the sword symbol on them. The problem is they were white border.
Oops.
Yeah.
All right, so we looked at Gaia's Cradle. All of us generally believe that the number is going to settle pretty high, maybe not $800 high, but it's certainly not going to hit 400 anytime soon. What do we think is going to happen from here in terms of reserve list cards? My philosophy is that there's 3 classes of reserve list cards. You have tier 1, that's Gaia's Cradle, dual lands, things that are very, very good, playable in a bunch of decks. Category 2, which is like Treachery, Undiscovered Paradise, Academy Rector, Memory Jar, where you've definitely cast this card in your Commander deck or in a cube, but you're not going to rush out to buy it. You're only going to own 1 or maybe 2. You don't need 4, and the average player can go their whole career without ever owning 1 and not really caring. And then finally, we have tier 3, which is the Wood Elementals and Polar Krakens of the world, where yes, the card is reserve list, but nobody is playing this in any real deck at all. So there's no underpinning demand, just a fairly high price because of the reserve list status.
So I don't actually think that reserve list cards will go down. Like settle maybe, but I don't really expect to see a regression, as it were, right? I think like these kind of these large increases are semi-permanent, right? Like Gaia's Cradle prior to setting a new record was also a new record for Gaia's Cradle, right? Like when it was at 350, that was also a high prior to where it was. I probably want to say about 2018 as well, right? When they were acquirable for like you're looking at like 150 to 200 for them. They don't. The thing about them is, no matter what people say, they don't get easier. They don't you don't have more copies, entering the market, right? People look at other options, right? I'm looking at Card King right now. Gaia's Cradle, the buy list on the Saga one's 415. This was at 360 yesterday. So whatever, they probably had to adjust them up, right? They probably certainly have caught wind of Channel Fireball's paying 600. We probably should offer a somewhat more real number than 360. But I'm more surprised by the fact that the gold border ones are offering $100 for $130 in trade credit. Right.
So I own 29 gold borders Gaia's Cradles, but when I looked them up at the start of this back in April, they were already selling at $100 on TCG Player. So the card has been pretty high for a while. I'm sure they've sold a lot. I think paying $100 on the gold border is actually likely correct or low.
Yeah, I think that substitute goods, given we're like the card's hitting a point where substitute goods start becoming much more important, and a $200 Gaia's Cradle, when you can look up TCG and say that they started at $800, which means that plus tax and whatever else, you're basically $900 out the door. Any number that starts with a 2 is going to be so much more appealing that the velocity is just going to be higher.
one of the other things in the 1999 World Championship deck box, the different decks weren't all the same rarity. The Kai Booty Wildfire Covetous Dragon deck, there were, I believe, 3 of per box, and then the Matt Lindy Gaia's Cradle only had 1 or 2 of the 12 deck display. So it's definitely a little bit more rare than something like City of Traders or Grim Monolith, which are somewhat affordable in a way that's not really obvious in the market. There's 12 decks. There were 5 Kai Booty and 2 Matt Lindy. Lindy has the Cradles in them.
Right, because why would the average player know that? Things like Monolith are kind of interesting, right? Because like they're not tier 1, but they're in like the heaviest, like the higher price points of tier 2 reserve list cards, to the point where like the price point probably affects their velocity somewhat. I've always inventory management with cards like that has always been a pain in the ass.
Yeah, as we fall down from the top of the Gaia's Cradle dual lands into that tier, and then especially the tier below it, I've had lengthy conversations with employees on pricing with things like Academy Rector, Treachery,
Metal Worker,
absolutely Metal Worker. Palancron is another big one where there's not a lot of liquidity at all. We had almost 100 Dream Halls in stock right before Christmas last year, which is just a card that has very low liquidity to the point where we have to figure out, okay, how do we get rid of this? What do we actually do?
Yeah, I used to buy list that stuff to APB before they cut their prices in half, to be honest. I really like the tier 1 reserve list cards going forward, though. Like if it's not going to hurt your liquidity and like your overhead's covered and your business is still doing good business, like if you have extra money to put around, like I really don't hate being into dual lands and cradles, honestly.
Where would you set the bottom line for that? Somewhere around like Yawgmoth's Will?
I think so, because like Will has so much utility that like it's good in powered or legacy cubes, it's good in EDH. I think Will might actually be the card. That's a good pick, Mike.
Whereas Mox Diamond is probably a little bit below that.
Well, Mox Diamond is weird because it exports, but for domestic only, yeah, probably.
Mox Diamond definitely doesn't have the casual demand that's going to be driving this, especially from a TCG player perspective.
Right, especially given the current situation. That's fair. So yeah, Diamond. I mean, Diamond's a weird one because it also has like that stupid FTB. But
Diamond is also more of a casual card, right? Like it's kind of offset in one way because it's generally a 4 of, right? But it's kind of offset in the other direction by you don't really want this in EDH as much as some of these other cards.
yeah, because the problem is you need a Tabernacle with your 4 Mox Diamonds.
So I guess Tabernacle's kind of in its own category, right? Where we have these real heavy hitters of $1,000 very narrow cards or $2,000 cards. Bazaars had a pretty noticeable increase at the start of the pandemic. When I was on Brainstorm a couple weeks ago, I talked about Bazaar selling out very well.
I actually love Bazaar and Workshop, to be honest.
I really love Bazaar as a card. I think Workshop might be a little bit worse, although it's clearly powerful. And I think Tabernacle is a little played out overall. I don't think we're going to see $3,000 Tabernacles anytime soon.
I think Tabernacle is the grim monolith of those standalone sets.
Whereas $2,000 Bazaars I can absolutely see.
Right, and I think that I really do. I think that Workshop is also another card that arbitrage is much better than it does domestically, which, given my work experience, is going to bias me somewhat. But
right.
Workshop is like the cards that are for vintage and franchise players, where it's like the basis of an archetype. Those cards are always going to move. Like it's a limited audience, obviously, but you're playing vintage, like not proxy. You already have a limited audience, so like that's okay.
Workshop also has a lot of commander demand. I sold a Workshop for $850 that was damaged or altered. It was something weird, and everyone at the booth thought, "Oh, that's never going to sell," and it sold within 4 hours of putting it out or so.
Yeah.
So why is Channel Fireball paying $600 on Gaia's Cradle? Paul, I know you had some interesting opinions on them paying that number in particular. If you want to start us off here.
Well, I think that $600 is kind of interesting. One is that it's above retail in, for instance, Japan and Europe, which is important. But it's a couple of things, right? So if like a near mint went $600, well, most Gaia's Cradles aren't near mint. We talked about the card's utility. We talked about how the card is old and obviously it's been reprinted. So most of them aren't near mint. So they're not really going to be paying $600 in most Gaia's Cradles. But more importantly is that if you're sharing a room with someone and your rent's $450, you might get $4 or $450 for like a played one. And that's the number that like really hits home very well. As well as the fact that they're only taking 4 per customer, which means that they are not interested in getting a 40 stack from one business that has to send them across an ocean. Theirs is very much a domestic play, and that kind of makes sense, right?
So the conditioning factor is pretty important. Channel Fireball on their page says that for cards from the dark to scourge that are slightly paid, they pay 70%, moderately played 50%, and damaged 30%. I know Channel Fireball really doesn't use that heavily played grade either. So $600 is $180 on anything that is HP or damaged, and $300 on MP and $420 on slightly played, which is pretty far off from $600. And I feel like I'd be pretty happy buying not near mint copies in any of those numbers right now.
For sure.
That largely fits my philosophy of whatever the old number was, you're safe paying that. Their difference between moderately played and damage is also pretty tight. I've seen some of their damage cards that look great. I know people who have bought them and resold them just on eBay and made a reasonable amount of money.
Right, and I think that's sort of the, that's the, as people do more online buy lists, that's sort of the thing, right, is you learn that, right, it's because this card has 3 nicks on it. Well, that's actually one of the other issues, right, is that as the card approaches $1,000, is that even if, like, not to, like, say, this isn't even about being scummy, right, like, it's, if a card's $1,000, you have to be very careful about how you grade it, because your outgoing customer is going to, well, if the card's like LP and they just gave you $1,000 for it, or $800, I mean, I'd be unhappy. And I think that's a reasonable thing where it gets to the point where you can't, there's no real flubbing on the grading. Like, the card has to be that nice because it's this expensive now. And you're going to see that with dual lands. You see that with a lot of the tier 1 reserveless cards that are this much money, that you have to be really strict on grading. And because the cards are useful, they got the crap beat out of them.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I think there's some interesting implications on that $600 number across the rest of this reserveless class, though. It's a very high profile example of somebody just claiming that this market price is real and correct on this card, which means that there's likely adjustments on everything else.
Well, I also think that it also just chews up store credit, which for an operation, well, like TOAMagic or like Channel Fireball, where outstanding store credit it eats it up, because it's someone where like they send in a big buy list, and if they're not cash strapped and they just have a bunch of credit floating, like being able to eat, $900 of credit is worth $600 just so you don't have outstanding liabilities.
Yeah, and that's a pretty nuanced argument, mostly because those outstanding store credit liabilities can sometimes improve the financial health of your business, since it depresses your actual profitability until they're called in.
If we want to zoom out a little bit, I think buying reserveless cards in August when there's a retroactive stimulus bill in the House right now is probably correct. Like we said, don't buy Polar Kraken. But if you can buy Cradles, even if Cradles are surging right now, this is still August when generally our market is suppressed. And if we potentially have a retroactive stimulus bill where people might get between a few thousand and potentially $10,000+, a lot of people are going to have a lot of discretionary spending money that they did not have 3 weeks ago, potentially. And having a full inventory going into that is probably going to be worth your time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Ed, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I think those points are probably the most obvious points, right? Like, I think just having a stocked inventory is generally pretty valuable in this business, especially with how hard it is to kind of find like one-stop shops, as it were. Right. If you look at, a lot of stores have been struggling to keep their inventory up, even though there's a lot of places don't offer, an opportunity to buy in person, right? The stores that have turned their inventory to be online instead, a lot of people saw their inventory decimated very quickly in March and April. So just trying to stock as a whole has just been very difficult for a lot of people. Having this kind of stock going forward, I think, is very, very valuable. Again, depending on the size of the stimulus, depending on what comes in, depending on how much money people have access to. A lot of traditional retail outlets have reported like entertainment doing very well. A lot of people have like bought things like computers, TVs, entertainment systems in the past, quarter or so. All of those have done very well. So it wouldn't surprise me that, once people have, again, depending on the size of stimulus, right? Like generally when people do get kind of that surge, the biggest things that people look for are the things that were far and away the most difficult for them to buy. That's why usually tax season, like what does well, you generally see dual lands, power, the big things, right? Like no one looks at an exciting purchase like, oh, I'm going to, buy the last like 15 or so like $10 cards to round out my EDH deck, right? People want to be getting, that one Gaia's Cradle or upgrading, their revised dual land into like a beta dual land or something to make it fancy, right? Those are the big things, and generally, those things do well. And I completely agree with the points that you two made about having stock inventories and kind of providing legitimacy to reserve list cards having these expensive cards, especially because if you look at the original tweet, I think it was from Pleasant Kenobi, there are a lot. I obviously don't have the metrics, but there's a lot of retweets, a lot of likes, a lot of comments, a lot of retweets with people who provide comment about it on their own. You have a lot of personalities that otherwise wouldn't be commenting about, the MTG finance side of things that are kind of getting into discussion about reserve lists, about price on cards, these kinds of things. So I think Channel Fireball did very well to, put their foot in the door, right? Like, how many can they buy, right? Because their buy list isn't automated anyways, right? It requires someone to actually manually accept it before you can send the cards in, right? And with only 4 per quantity anyways, or 4 per customer anyways, realistically, how much are they buying, right? Like, is it reasonable that they'll get like 600 Gaia's Cradles? I don't think that's reasonable. I'd be surprised if they got more than like 200 or so, which is a nice chunk of change, right? But that's something that they'll at worst break even on. By dumping this amount of money in, it probably creates more opportunities for them to get more money out of other similar class assets, dual lands or whatever in the future. Because if they can quietly raise those prices, right? And because you have to keep things in perspective, right? Like a month ago, if someone wanted to trade a Gaia's Cradle for what's a comparable duel, like probably a play Tropical Island, right? Like that's probably, a fair trade. Now, right? Like a Gaia's Cradle will get you like 2 Tropical Islands, right? Like, does that make sense? Absolutely not. So like this gives them the opportunity for them to now raise the price on a Tropical Island to be more in line with what a Gaia's Cradle was. I think like those were the two major points that you guys hit on that I think are very, very good in terms of this discussion and kind of providing some context as to why all this is happening.
One thing I think is pretty interesting here as well is with the discussion of the Postal Service and having problems there. UPS is more money, but not particularly more money when you're dealing in expensive product. You're looking about $8 to $12 to send a generic like 1 pound package through a lot of the country. So by having some of these bigger cards, it helps sell all the smaller cards that someone's been buying at the same time, especially if we see a situation where the mail supply kind of locks up, TCG player loses some competitive efficiency and buyers have to go to other websites to buy cards. Having the big headliner that someone definitely needs to buy is going to make it much easier to get the extra $100 or $200 of smaller cards at the same time.
I mean, that works on both sides, right? It also incentivizes people to look through other stuff if they know that they're selling Channel Fireball at Gaia's Cradle, and they potentially have some extra time on their hands given the current situation. It incentivizes them to make a larger buy list because they know they're already sending the package for 1 card. And when they realize it might cost them $8 to $10 to send the package because they have to do it through UPS, they start looking for other stuff to put in the box.
I want to thank everyone for watching this video and hearing us talk about Gaia's Cradle for so long. You can give us feedback in the comments or on Twitter. I'm at TOAMichael, Paul is at PRFeudo, and Ed is NWin13. Thank you all for watching. Really appreciate it.